So which I came in 4 or 5 minutes before the class was over because I was on 3 different clocks. A computer with Colorado time, Birmingham time, and then the time of the. I was like, oh, I thought I was early. It's like,
Yeah.
I
terrible.
switched one of my like white privilege, one of my little segments on my watch to UTC time. Like, I don't want to know how many rings I complete today. I don't care, but I need to know what time it is, like in UTC time.
Zulu
Screw the
time.
rings.
Zulu time.
Yeah. Oh
That's how
boy.
I'm
So
used to referring to it.
yeah, you show up when you get there, right?
Zulu time is how we refer to Greenwich time, UTC time in the military.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Our article here.
Your
Got some
screen,
highlighted.
that's how mine looks like right now. Are you showing my screen?
I hope not.
No, mine's highlighted like that.
Oh, yikes. No, I thought for a second you meant the background. I was like,
No.
if that's the case, then that's kind of eerie.
No,
But
my PDF is highlighted like that.
gotcha. Awesome. Yeah, that's the water wheel at my school where I went for my PhD. It is the oldest working water wheel in the eastern half of it, I think, something like that. Also, yeah. And Austin, yay. And forgot to say hello, Ivy. Glad you could join us for the evening.
Welcome,
Hello.
Ivy.
Missed you this morning. It was a very candid conversation.
Oh man. No, I had a prior engagement, so I figured I'd join the evening.
Sounds very important, a prior engagement.
Yeah.
All right. Let's talk about toxic leadership. So I mentioned in a little bit of the description, and Austin, I hope you had a good workout, bud. So yeah, mentioned in the kind of introduction or the little bit of description of the article that it is very kind of academic-y, right? So it has conducted research, it has data, like there were statistical analysis conducted on the data. But that part isn't necessarily as important as, say, the definitions of items, as well as more of the revelations that came out of it. So if you haven't had a chance to read it yet, and you do later this week, I would really focus more on the literature part. You can read through the followership typologies, which is important to this article, but not as important as some other pieces, because we're going to talk about followership for 2 weeks. So this just kind of gives you a brief intro to what that looks like. So really focus on the literature review piece, and then really more so the end pieces where we have just like a summary and we have discussion and we have kind of this future research piece and conclusion. So where I want to start with, I write out some individual questions, is really thinking about the definition of toxic leadership first. And I think there are probably many definitions that we can go by for toxic leadership, but I want to focus specifically on what they mention in this piece here. So let's see, 94%. So probably like there's 5 of you, so probably like 4.75 of you have worked or volunteered with or were supervised by a toxic leader. So with that said, when we look at toxic leadership, look at the definition. First kind of mentioned was bad leadership. So I think when we say inherently good versus bad, there's not enough distinction there, which thankfully other people came along and said, specifically, maladjusted, malcontent are often malevolent and even malicious. A lot of M words there. What I what I take from that even more is more than malicious. I actively choose to work against you as an employee, or you as a volunteer, or you as my subordinate. And again, this is also from, again, the perspective that a leader has someone following them, right? So they have subordinates or reports, or there is kind of a stratified like leadership organization there. But I think this gets even to more understandable like chunks and pieces here. Pettiness, abusiveness, maliciousness, self-aggrandizement, and general uncaring attitude towards others. So that last piece is what I think for not just this class, but future generation students in general are going to have the hardest time with that last piece, general uncaring attitude towards others. I think that goes against kind of the fundamental grain of students that attend future generations. Like, I don't get into community building or seed scale, or, you know, a lot of our students are Peace Corps or AmeriCorps. You don't do that kind of work if you have an uncaring attitude towards other human beings. You just don't. So that one I think is the one that hits in general everybody, and somebody be uncaring towards another person. And then the last part in terms of definitions, I have a little bit of a harder time with this. Destructive behavior, okay, I get that, coupled with certain dysfunctional personal traits. So that part I think starts to get into a psychology piece where, you know, you can see, I think I guess, less subjectivity to something that is petty. Whereas if I look at personal traits and someone being dysfunctional within personal traits, that starts to be a judgment call and subjective on my part in terms of how I perceive versus it is or it isn't. So that one I have a little bit of a harder time. I don't disagree with it, but it's more of, okay, how are we defining those personal traits? Because there are, you know, hundreds of different ways we could look at personal traits of a leader, and then within that, what are dysfunctional, right? So with those definitions in mind, yeah, personality disorder can certainly be one, but at the same time, when you think of where you experience these things, where you experience toxic leadership, where are you most likely to experience this? Usually a workplace. And where are you least likely, unless you say work in HR, going to know about somebody with a personality, like a dissociative personality disorder, or where there's a full diagnosis. I mean, like, so we talk about empathy and say an autism scale. That's one thing, and which HR may or may not know. There were plenty of things when I was in HR. I'm like, I don't want to know this about certain people. I don't want to know what medications they're taking when they fill out healthcare, you know, forms, kind of stuff. But the rest of the employee pool wouldn't know those kind of things. So unless somebody has, you know, let's say your dysfunctional leader has flat out said, well, I have XYZ, dissociative personality disorder, what have you. So with kind of that definition in mind, anybody want to share who you have worked with that was toxic as a leader? You know, who was that toxic leader? Why were they toxic? You know, when you look at these definitions, what made them toxic? Since about 4.75 of you have.
Yeah, I think I had one particular leader in mind comes for me, but that was early on in my military career when I was in my advanced individual training. And I had a drill sergeant who really nobody liked him. And I can't remember the names of any of my drill sergeants except this one, Drill Sergeant Barsamian. And the reason why he was so toxic, and the particular incident that I really remembered him, one morning as I had done everything I was supposed to do, and it was time for my morning prayer. And so I was saying my prayers, and I was saying it in front of my locker, my little space, because we didn't have much space. And the man came right up to me and said, Private, what are you doing? Everybody else is doing their work, and you're sitting here, you're praying. And so he was trying to disrupt me from saying my prayers. I tell you, after he left, everybody in the whole platoon said, if he does that ever again, we're all going to stop and we're going to join you. They were so upset about it. But there was little things like that he would do, but that was like probably the biggest thing. Everybody was just so flabbergasted.
So do you think people didn't intervene at the time because they were so shocked, or he's a drill sergeant and we'll
a little bit of both.
Get him next time?
A little bit of both. They were just like
paralyzed in the moment. I think that's what most people
like
experience.
Badgered, Mm-hmm.
Like, how could someone ever even do that? I mean, they saw me doing that every morning, and it was like nothing but a thing. And they knew that I would get up, I would do my stuff, I would help out, and then I would do my thing. So nobody nobody ever thought. I mean, we lived together for 3 months. Nobody thought anything of it.
Anything, yeah. Well, and I think, yeah, when you look at some of these definitions too, I think abusiveness falls in there. What makes, I think, that situation a tad more difficult is we expect some of that, I'm not going to say behavior, but also behavior from a drill sergeant. Like, you expect somebody that will not like to interrupt something that is completely appropriate, but loud to a degree, like abusive, or at least how I I would die if a drill
all my
sergeant
other
yelled at
drill
me.
sergeants never did anything like that. They were all very respectful, very accommodating, but at the same
So crossing
time,
the line of discipline, I think, is what I'm getting more at.
Yeah, I mean, all my other drills. See, I was like always the star soldier. I made sure I never gave them an opportunity. Like, I never used religion as an excuse. So I always made sure I was the most obedient, the most what do you call it? Like, if they said do push-ups, I was the loudest, most, like, when they said sound off, you heard me the most. In fact, I got an award during basic, the most, I'm forgetting it, but and I remember the commander in basic said, I wish I had, I forgot the number, 100 and some odd of you Muslims in my, because then I wouldn't have to do anything. So
then they're out of the job.
Soldier. That was it. Most motivated soldier. So that was the deal. I made sure for that particular drill sergeant, he was just, as they said, I don't want to say what the other soldiers were saying about him, but that was basically, he was a bully is what he really was. And I never had anything like that the rest of my career, except one other time when I went when I was finally outside the military. One other person tried to do that, and it was a retired military person who went and said, "No, we don't do that." It's just usually the military environment, they were very accommodating of religious rights. So that was like the exception, that individual. Yeah.
Other folks dealing with toxic leaders, or have an example of dealing with a toxic leader.
So I guess I don't want to say like agree or kind of agree, but like I feel like a lot of times leaders who are in positions that it's kind of like with the drill sergeant, it's kind of like expected a little bit of like, I don't want to say toxicity, but like firmness, that type of thing. Like I had the head chef of this restaurant I worked at. I was a prep chef and I was like downstairs, and this guy was like the stereotypical yes chef, thank you chef. Like it was
Gordon Ramsay.
oh my gosh, it was horrible. Like there are so many OSHA violations, and I would be in this basement making sauces, making salads, making like thousands of sheets of bacon, which was awful. um, but like the entire time I was there, like he would do this thing where he would give me a task, not provide any type of training, and then go, "Oh wow, this is awful," and then make it.
Mm.
And of course, he's trained. He knows how to do this thing, and then it comes out looking amazing, exactly as he wanted to. And he would congratulate himself, and I'm just like,
Hmm.
okay. And so as I'm reading some of like the descriptions in the toxic leadership, where you have like your dimension and then description, like the narcissism, I'm like, okay, yep, there you go. Unpredictability, yes. Self-promotion, yes. Like abusive supervision, yes. So like I would definitely say he was a toxic leader, like for sure, because he had, I mean, of course he was in charge, so people were looking to him to like, be a leader and to give instructions. Like the way that he went about it was just, it was just awful and just unwarranted the entire time. He ended up forcing me to train somebody and then fired me after I got done training them, and then told me I was incompetent and trying to
Oh.
make me write documents or sign documents stating that I was incompetent. I know, right? I've never heard of that before. Like, who fires you and says, "Oh yeah, can you sign these documents saying that you're awful and this is why you're being
No,
fired right now?"
definitely not.
I'm like, we're in Georgia. You can just fire me and tell me to go home, and I'll be like, okay, I'll just go home. Like,
Yeah, it's like that's how at will employment works.
exactly. If
Thanks.
you don't
Yeah.
want me to be here, I'll leave. That's okay. But like, it was just, it was bad. I would be there for like 8 hours, and I go leave to go eat something, and he's like, "Where are you?" I don't know. About to die. So yes, definitely can say I've had someone that fits that description of the toxic leadership. So I'm part of that 94%, 100%.
I don't know about, I wanted to comment on Ivy. Thank you for sharing that story. I was thinking, I mean, to me, you appear so nice. And I think that some of these people that are like this, that are production goal oriented, can get away with that. So in other words, I'm not going to go through all this, but I'm impressed that somebody could just come up with one, because I've got like 30, how many hours do we have left of this? But anyway, I feel like if someone is nice and gentle and polite, they take it as, oh, I'm going to push you over. And it triggers that bullying even more until they get stood up to. So my very brief in my experience, I did mention I was a military contractor in Kosovo in 2002, 2005, through those years, and I did some work in Furzai, and I saw things like that really bordered on sociopathy. And the only thing I can comment, the very first time we drove around, before we even got to some villages, he's like, yeah, this one guy, his name was Russ. Man, this guy, he's the worst I've ever, of all the very bad toxic I could fill a book, but this one, he's the worst, because I think he wanted to get people killed through indirectly. He wanted to, like, yeah, send those guys over to that place, and all those
That's a
all
whole
that guys.
level of sociopath right there.
I know
That
it's almost too bad for as an example, but like this is, but it was also through a mask of great, it's almost like I would say professionalism. And so it was like, it was really weird. It was very difficult. And this other guy and me, we did the most we could to get out of his supervision, because it was just like, but he could also be really good. So that's the crazy thing about these kind of people. They could also be very, very good at certain things that they do. And it gives him, I don't want to say a license, but they kind of can get away with it. I mean, you can see that in sexual harassment people again and again.
Yeah, when it's not corrected, there is some level of approval when it's not corrected.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think we probably all had some toxic leadership, right? Didn't we just come out of a I'm just kidding, I don't want to get political, but we definitely can objectively say that there were some issues that we all had to deal with this last 4 years. I mean, I vote Republican, I can say it. And so I can tell you that that's not normal anyway.
Well, and I think you can say, though, regardless of political party,
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. But I mean, sorry about
someone who is true. Well, I was going to lead us into this discussion about narcissism. Whether you agreed with political policy or policy decisions or direction on certain pieces of legislation or what have you, narcissism was an underlying trait a whole time. Like, you could love the guy, but also say he's a narcissist. That's why I brought up, I can't remember if he was president or what the technical title of the leader of Iran is. Not the religious leader, the elected leader of Iran.
I believe it's the Shah.
But he is just the Shah. Thank you very much.
It broke up.
The Shah in the late 70s, the Shah in the late 70s was put into power with the assistance of the United States, but was so self-indulgent and narcissistic to where even when you have a whole country of people who were in like poverty and are starving, literally starving, and he's got meals flown in from Europe on a Concorde. He's got lavish vacations in other parts of the world. And I think you could, to a degree, say that he thought that he deserved it, that I am this level of individual above because I have this job. So what I find interesting from when you look at just the scientific, like statistical analysis of these different variables, which you don't have to go through all of this stuff with the research piece, but when you look at what had direct effects on toxic leadership, if I am a toxic leader, where is the most negative effect? It was narcissism, specifically, that looked at a follower and said, I'm going to affect you most by being a narcissist. Why then, if we understand this kind of perspective of narcissism, whether it's through examples, looking at a definition of someone who thinks of themselves in such a high regard that I can do no wrong, nobody can correct me, I have blinders on to my own actions, kind of the aspects of what you would think of when you look at a narcissistic person. It's all about them, right? So do you think, from your perspective, dealing with toxic leaders, think that narcissism would have the most effect on followers?
In my opinion, if I may, because narcissism can be perceived as great leadership. They shine, some of these, and so we, the followers, if you're in that position, can feed that unknowingly, and then the narcissist can continue to be fed and fed. It's like a monster. It continues to be fed and becoming bigger and bigger and bigger, like something out of Hollywood. And it's very easy to deflate them. There's just nothing. I mean, this is not something I'm saying. I didn't become an expert in it. I just read up a lot of stuff that people can look up from genuine sources like Psychology Today and such. I was just interested in it because the word was being tossed around so much, and it is a clinical diagnoses that we can't just say that guy, like someone who's into his, I had an argument, not an argument, a discussion with a friend of mine, like, well, maybe we're all a little narcissistic. Well, I mean, yes, but I mean, clinically, we can't say that someone is the extreme. You know, if you're vain, it doesn't mean you're narcissistic. You may just, for a variety of reasons, you look good or whatever. But I think they have the highest danger because sometimes they can go undetected.
Well, and I think this morning what we were talking about too was this tipping point of where success can lead to narcissism, even if unintended, like unchecked, right?
Well, look at Charlie Rose. I just admired Charlie Rose so much. I just saw something with him a little bit ago, and he was in a blip or something. And I thought, man, he is still, if you don't look at the background that we know now, a man to be admired by the way nobody can match him, in my opinion. You know, I was watching him even when I was pretty young, and I was like, wow. But then we see that there's a flip side to that, and it somehow manifested itself in many, not just one, but many, a pattern of abuse, and that's not normal.
Anybody else want to?
That's a good point when you brought up Charlie Rose, and then there was several other people, especially in that Me Too movement. People use their position to.
Well, was it use of their position?
I'm sorry, you broke up.
Awesome. Was it truly narcissism, or is it more of, I think I can get away with something?
No, I think it was a little both. I really do. I mean, they kind of got full of themselves. Who was and I think they, you know, the reason why they felt that they could get away with something was because they were full of themselves. Like they felt, you know, they became that narcissist, right? They got into that place where like, hey, you know, nobody can touch me, right? So I'm so and so. So
And
that's why.
It's more like, why was Charlie Rose not satisfied with a relationship that he could have had with one person? I'm sure there would have been someone that would have been very happy, and he would have been very happy with her. Why these 30-year younger women that were in a mismatch of power? Why that? See, that feeds your hypothesis about the narcissism, because if it was just, man, maybe he just is a lover, you know, I don't know. He's a ladies' man. But there's something more pathological there than just that, I think.
Yeah, people
Power differential.
Yeah, there's people who push themselves over on others. There's a lot of that going on. You see power plays, whether it be men over women, men over men. I mean, those power plays that happen all the time.
It feeds I guess the point is it feeds, according to what I've read, again, but it feeds that old-fashioned word ego. It feeds that like, oh, I need to get this person because that one is the one that's going to feed, and I'm going to look like I'm going to have a so-called trophy here, and trophy after trophy after trophy, including people that are no longer, they're depersonalized. Doesn't matter what's inside of that person, so long as they look really good and I look really good with them. And
a lack of empathy.
I happen to recall another situation where I came across somebody who was toxic, and he tried to do a power play, and I wound up, I remember he kind of tried to do like maybe a physical aggression over me, and I didn't respond very well. I was about ready to square back off on him if it wasn't for the fact that a friend of mine kind of like put a hand on my shoulder or something, just said, it just isn't worth it, because he literally was he literally, was one of those male. He was trying to do a male dominance aggression thing, and and I was like, no, you're not going to do that. You're not going to try to make me feel this big. And I was not going to have any of that. But my friend's like, no, it's not worth it. Don't do it. But because I just wasn't going to play that game. But if it wasn't for him stopping me, I would have made the King Kong type movement type of thing, but because I didn't respond to it. So like further on in the article, there's that followership where like what kind of follower you are. Sometimes I'd be the pragmatic follower, but other times I think I'm the what was the other one? The effective follower. Yeah, that would be me.
So kind of other thoughts either on the narcissism piece or any other variable you found interesting, or because I'll get to a little bit of other questions, but some thoughts so far from folks?
So I think the narcissism part, I think it might be really like hard to like really pinpoint out, especially because I don't know, there's like a really fine line between narcissism and like self-confidence. And like, I feel like self-confidence is something that we definitely value in like, not just like, I guess like in Western culture, but also especially as a leader. Like you want someone who is confident in themselves when you talk to like a leader. Like you go talk to your boss, like, hey, I have a question. And like they don't really have an answer, but you want them to sound confident in that answer.
Right.
Like you want to make sure that you are like, you're making the right choice and they're helping you make the right choice. So there's like a really fine line between like narcissism and self-confidence. So it's really hard to kind of tell. But I think the key thing in terms of like narcissism is that like someone who has these tendencies would believe that they're right, like no matter what, regardless of the situation, and they are confident in that. And I think
and
the
a fake it till you make it.
Yeah, exactly. But like the thing is, it kills productivity because like you can't develop and be better if you can't admit that you were wrong or that you did something wrong. You can't learn from your mistakes if you don't think that you made a mistake. So like it's that, I think that's one of the reasons why narcissism is such a key aspect of this, like in terms of like toxic leadership. I think that was one of the reason, or just a reason why it's such an underlying thing.
You lost the election.
I mean, can you imagine George Washington, the opposite of what he was? I mean, that was a confident man, as you're describing. And we would want him to stand up to the British. And many, many, many examples of great American leadership at all levels, not just military, that just came to mind. But to be able to say, I'm going to stand aside for something greater. And that's not what a narcissist, in my view, would choose to do.
Well, I'm trying to think too of, because what's not really researched as much, or at least not statistically analyzed in this, is gender versus narcissism. I'm having a hard time thinking of, and maybe somebody comes to your all's minds before it did mine, a female narcissist. Of all the leaders we know of names and examples, and
Maybe Catherine the Great. I don't know, but I think she had other problems.
oh, Catherine the Great.
They're making some kind of, I don't know, series about her now with interest. But I studied her for a Russian class. I mean, a Russian history class. But that might have been something beyond narcissism, some kind of. I could women. I don't know.
Well, some people
Or
said
Austin,
that. Oh, okay. Some people said Hillary was narcissist.
the narcissist.
I don't know.
Yeah, I think going back to the original question, I think narcissism, I think, is an issue, or one of the biggest issues, is because ultimately leadership is a partnership between the follower and the leader. And if the follower doesn't buy in, then there's not really leadership. And so I feel like if you're constantly focused on yourself, you're not building that partnership between who you're following.
Exactly.
Because ultimately, at a certain extent, you have the choice to follow. I mean, obviously, you don't want to lose your job, stuff like that. But at a certain extent, you're not going to buy into anything. Because I've seen where people just any creative instinct in them is burnout, or any willingness to take a risk is gone because they're
Right.
so scared of that person. So
Exactly.
yeah, I think that's one of the reasons why.
Well, and the whole concept of a leader and a follower is a leader in empowering a follower to point out when things are wrong or just to fix things. I mean, we would say a lot like, even if it's not my job, if I see something that's not working, I'm going to fix it, unless it's, a major, massive thing that requires more than me just like turning something off or turning something on. And then there are other times too where it's like, you know what, we worked on this and we either fix it or we let it burn. Like, some things just need to go away. So there is that, like, whenever I think a leader has a false expectation of a follower, you burn down that bridge with buy-in.
My warrant officer said the E4s run the army. So to me, I always that statement was very pragmatic to me, because like he was basically saying, the followers made things happen. So to me, good leaders were ones who help the followers clear the path. So the opposite, the toxic leaders, are the ones who kind of like throw obstacles in your way. Right? So when they're throwing obstacles in your way, when they're being that malicious leader, and they're trying to do everything in their power to prevent you from being promoted, when they try to steal your thunder, when you're the one who's the one who came up with the idea, that's a toxic leader,
Right.
And that's to Austin's point, right? Austin was saying, it's like, they steal your you don't want to be creative anymore, because if you come up with the idea, then why should I come up with the idea? So-and-so is just going to take the idea and take credit for it anyways.
Yeah. I wonder, one thing that is really popping in mind when I was looking at the followership part the most, and the typology was, first, it can, I said like the disgruntled, what was that one? The disgruntled or aggressive, alienated type of follower. Could he somehow flip, become a leader? And because I've seen that, but also I've seen a lot of followers that are this type of follower, and I always thought, I don't want to be this type of I wouldn't call myself a follower. I'm very independent minded, but I would call myself someone who buys in and is gonna, I'm like a hired, I'm there to be in part of the team and do my best, but I'm not gonna follow you to like off the cliff. And I always wondered, there are some decent leaders that end up with this kind of really bad follower, and I always wondered about that if there's anything that that could contribute toward perhaps. I remember one boss that was, and that was a bad team, and I remember it was like, I can't do anything with these people, he's venting all this kind of stuff, and I kind of agreed. It's like, well, yeah, it's time to take a decision and start firing, but we couldn't because it was like by committee, it was really difficult.
Well, I mean, that kind of gets to the question of like, are toxic leaders really leaders? When you boil down the behavior, you boil down the, I mean, to a degree, a little bit of the psychology, a little bit of the personality, a little bit of the results, the expectations. Exactly, Austin. Sometimes it's by title only, like, yeah, I'm a leader because it says CFO after my name, or it says vice president after my name. So I'm going to do, and again, that sometimes feeds into the narcissism of, well, I'm the such and such. So yeah, are toxic leaders really leaders? So Austin says, nope, by title only. You're a designated leader. You are not an implied leader. And I think what Ivy said, it's exactly the point too. And I think we said it this morning as well, that there's that tipping point of confidence that, oh, am I overly confident or am I just plain darn narcissistic? Of, well, you are no longer really a true leader in that regard. So I'm glad you bring up the followership types. And in fact, he references Jean Linden Blumen. Yeah. She's one of the authors for The Art of Followership. The second week of followership, we're reading a chapter from that book. She is not the kind of initial guru of followership, although she's right there up with Ira Schleff is really who purported followership and studies followership, and he's like my academic crush is Ira Schleff. So when we look at all of these things, so we'll get to followership, and I always find it interesting that toxic leadership is springboarded from followership because we define what's toxic by how leaders are treating those that report to them, work for them, what have you. So when we look at toxic leadership, though, and we understand it, we can identify it, not always right away. What do we do about it? I mean, with at least democratically elected leaders, let's say in politics, we just don't vote for them. But when we work for somebody and we volunteer for, what is it that we can do?
You got to, depending, you can complain to HR, you can go get a new job, you can confront the person. You can, sometimes people become passive aggressive.
Mm-hmm.
Depends on your personality type, how you're able to handle it.
So somebody was
Okay.
explaining a situation this morning that was completely untenable. Like it was, this leader was creating a revolving door of people leaving on average every 6 months.
Whoa.
Because of an executive director, president, CEO type. So where I'm like, at that point, there only is the option of I remove myself from the situation. So, because again, when we look at narcissists, there is generally nothing I can do or say or provoke that is going to change how they react. They have blinders on to the rest of the world. So me leaving also isn't going to do anything, but me, as one of my favorite basketball coaches used to say, you're wasting oxygen by talking. Yeah, it was Rick Pitino. He was the one who said, you're like, to a player that was complaining, you're wasting oxygen. So for me to say something to a narcissistic leader, well, we need to change this, or this is what needs to happen, or you're creating a situation that is uncomfortable, unprofessional, yada, yada. They don't care. So I'm wasting oxygen.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on how high up the chain they are, right?
Yeah, and even when you look at, say, an executive director, they still report to the board, but how often has a board been either empowered or felt like coming in and dealing with a situation where the CEO or executive director is in charge? So not very often.
Yep.
I mean,
Especially if there's a track record of success.
Right.
I mean, it's a good, like I've probably faced and facing right now, organizations that inadvertently become very top heavy. And so it is we did have, I forgot, a very toxic leader. I didn't have her, I can't speak to how or why, but it was just widely known. The revolving door, many things, people just left. But it's so difficult to remove that person because it's almost like it's very threatening to the leaders themselves. There's that. And so it's almost like, oh, there's a two tiers, you know, well, we got to stick with, I mean, I don't know, maybe I'm just perceiving it that way, but I don't know, when it becomes so top heavy and there's no voice that represents, and I'm not talking about unions or anything, but then it seems like it's very difficult. It's up to the other leaders around them, and they, that rapport and that it may reflect on them somehow, becomes very, very difficult to remove them.
Well, I'm going to give you an example. I had read this article on LinkedIn the other day, and now The Verge is reporting on that a lot of employees are leaving the company, but the owners
Oh,
of
at
the
Basecamp.
you've heard about it, right? Yeah, these guys said they're just getting rid of all of their 360 reviews. I mean, you're like, what? Who does this? And they're like, we're not needing it. We don't need HR, basically. We don't need all these things that are considered. We don't need employee resource groups. We don't need 360 reviews. We don't need all that. So we're just getting rid of it.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious too, Austin, with your case, you know, it's one thing with like the caseworker and the director of development close with the ED, but the board hires the ED, and the board typically doesn't want to admit they made a mistake. But I'd love to hear more about this kind of crappy situation.
Well, I'm gone now, so it's good.
Yeah, so you can say what you want.
Yeah, so well, I kind of said what I want while I was there, and that didn't get me far. But I tend to do that, get in trouble for it. Let's see. Yeah, so it's just one of those things where I don't think the board had enough awareness about what's going on. Like, they just kind of showed up to board meetings and would show up to events, but really didn't know the inner workings of the organization. And I mean, there was no way I was going to go to them because I feel like all hell would break loose. So, because if the ED or somebody found out about that, then oh goodness. So, and yeah, it's just nice, and it was very quick. Like you'd say something, and it would quickly get around to everybody, and you're like, that was supposed to say private, and so and there's been there's been like 4 or 5 people that have left in the past several years. So,
Yikes. So, and this is a human services organization. I mean, if you mentioned caseworker, I'm
yes.
assuming.
Yeah.
So one organization I worked for also kind of had same kind of structure, caseworkers and case managers and primary counselors. We would run through caseworkers or case managers and primary therapists like water. And the board had asked a few times of like, why do these people keep leaving? And the executive director would explain it away like, oh, they find a better opportunity. And sometimes salary was part of it. And so she would explain it away like, oh, we train them and then they get hired away by these other organizations because we're really good at training our people. And I'm like, yeah, that's part of the problem. But she herself and then our not treatment director, our clinical director, both were very toxic leaders, and it just flooded downhill from there. And the board just chooses to kind of ignore. Either they don't ask the right questions, they don't know what they're doing, or they don't want to admit that they made a mistake, or they realize there's a mistake, but they don't want to do anything to fix it because of the optics.
Yeah, our ED was very good at smoothing things over too. I actually turned it into a verb. So every time somebody would leave, we would end up going to this frozen custard place across the street, and it was called Abbott's. And I would always call whenever we would go over there. I'm like, "Are we getting abboted today? Is someone leaving or getting fired?"
Wow.
But it was always like, "Oh, they're just not a good fit," or "Oh, they didn't have the qualifications, or it just didn't work out." And I'm like, "No, like I was in here when y'all were screaming at each other. Like Yeah, so it's just
Right. I
but
literally had a toxic leader yell at me for a follower, someone that reported to me used color copies versus black and white copies, like literally yelling. I'm like, wow, is that the best use of your time and resources? Your situation also reminds me, I don't know if you've seen Office Space. It is an older
Yes.
90s-ish movie where they go to Tchotchkes to get coffee at like 9 o'clock on Monday. They're like, I gotta get out of here. This is, yeah, you gotta watch it. You gotta watch Office Space and get your red stapler.
Oh.
Just saying. Just red swing line stapler. You gotta go watch that this week, Austin.
You gotta watch it, Austin, because
Yeah.
it's the time of and everybody else of I guess
Yeah.
us more Gen Xers, whatever, not Gen Xers, but very close. Yeah, he's
Yeah.
doing yeah,
Which,
and
You gotta
it's
see
like
it. It's a typical toxic leader. I mean, this
yeah.
dude is just wow.
It's a comedy though, so
Yeah, it's funny.
yeah, I know it's got Gary Cole in it.
it's got Jennifer Aniston when she was really old.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've seen clip. I've tried to find it actually, but
I've got the
have not
DVD. I
been
can
able
just
to
send it
find
to
like
you.
Yeah, I
find
have the DVD too. I'll just mail it to you.
Oh, it's no, it's okay. I was about to say it's free on Amazon, but it's not. So
Yeah, my boss always, to her credit, she loves that movie, and I think it helps her because she's so she's so cool.
Awesome.
But it's got to have had an effect to see like the satire of the really bad boss.
Yeah.
yeah.
I'll burn it down. I burn the place down.
that's a good example of toxic leadership in the comedy.
It is.
It
It
really
is. It is. It definitely is. So we can, I think
And the funny part is getting rewarded
right for bad behavior.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think the biggest lesson learned, or the only thing that we can control is that we leave the situation, we go away. I still check back in with one organization where there was very toxic leadership. I'm always like, so who's still there? Who is left? Why do they still look at this? Like, I'm checking LinkedIn. I'm like, are they still there? Like, why are they putting up with this crap? Why are they putting up with this toxic environment that is not healthy for anyone? So yeah, I always look back at, hey, I can at least remove myself. And to some degree, when you think about, and especially it's a paid position, right? At what point am I willing to take a pay cut to find a better situation because the situation I'm in is causing me mental or physical or both issues? And that's the unfortunate part. And it bothers me, like Austin, with the stigma that, well, people, if they don't do well in the for-profit world, they'll just go to the nonprofit world and they'll be okay. That one, the nonprofit world will accept bad leaders, and two, we're gonna pay people like a third, a quarter of what their value is to an organization. And so it's something, there's the perception that we were working against, but then also this, well, the nonprofit sector will take you if you are a cruddy leader, that will just take anybody. And we got to keep fighting against that one, unfortunately. It's my life's work to, like, yeah, you can have a second career in the nonprofit sector, sure. But if you sucked at the for-profit one that you had before it, then you're going to suck at it again in the nonprofit one. So it doesn't matter what the sector is, or if you move from government to nonprofit. If you stink either way in any sector, it's not going to make any better of a situation. It just so happens that people think, well, I can go to the nonprofit sector and nobody's going to notice that I suck. So we'll leave it there. I know it's hard to talk about toxic leadership and not feel like a wet towel, right? It's kind of
Yeah.
not a fun topic about. So I hope this is a very consoling session where you realize not everybody's a toxic leader, and every situation is not toxic, but toxic leaders do exist, and there are things that we can do to get outside of toxic leadership, and we can choose not to be a toxic leader
Go to the
as
polls.
well. Yeah,
Yeah.
the polls.
I think
Ours
that's
are
the
closed now.
I think that's the best thought, Professor, because the thing is that we can choose if we gauge ourselves, if we truly see, am I becoming the bad, or even the bad follower or the bad leader?
Robert,
Or I'm just not effective anymore.
Robert, I think that's a really good point to bring up to close as we close. Always check yourself
Mhm.
to make sure you're not that guy or
Mhm.
that
Yeah.
gal.
What is it? If you look around and you're the only one that
The only
isn't, maybe you are the asshole or
sucker.
whatever.
Yeah, the sucker
Or the
around the table.
sucker, or the
Yeah.
exactly. Well, next week we'll talk about followership, like my favorite topic, for the next 2 weeks. So I'm excited about it. You can't have leadership without followership. So if y'all need anything in the next week, give me a holler, and I'll see you here next Tuesday.
Same bat time.